This is the Everything 80s podcast. Today we're looking at 12 things that made the 1980s the greatest decade. Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. I'm Jamie, and today we're looking at 12 amazing things that made the 80s stand out, why it was such a great decade, why we love these things so much. But before we get to that, if you haven't already, here's the obligatory subscribe to the podcast, wherever you find your podcast messages. Okay, that's done. Let's get right to it. Okay, so as we're looking back here, if you grew up in the decade, it's an amazing time to be alive. If you're from a younger generation, you might be curious looking back at what the 80s was all about. Like you see it popping up and just kind of, retro stuff. And, it was a time where you had a lot of, some of the best movies of all time, some of the best music ever made, some of the best TV shows, iconic toys. It's, kind of like the decade associated with nostalgia and the style, the memories kind of live on. So me personally, I was born in the late 70s, and similar to anyone who was born then, we weren't a child of the 70s, but one of the 80s. We were just getting old enough to embrace everything the 80s would have to offer. So that isn't to say that if you were older in the 80s that you didn't appreciate it, but, your main and fondest memories tend to be when you're a kid. So, if you grew up right in the heart of the 80s, those are the things you tend to remember the best. They call it golden age thinking. It's kind of looking back with, rose-colored glasses, but, most things always seem better when you're a kid. You ask, and it's applicable to any decade. If you ask anyone who grew up, no matter what decade, they will tell you that's when things were the best. Like sports were better. Music was better. Movies were better. It was just a better time to be alive. Like we just look back on these things fondly. And as, the time goes by, we don't tend to think about all the crap that was happening. We tend to remember, the last time we had a memory of it. And over time, I think this filters out any of the garbage, and then you're left with pure nostalgia. So this is just going to look at 12 things that I think made the 80s the greatest decade. So, they're of course from my vantage point, so you can yell or scream at me in any way you want. Okay, the first thing is the movies. So, it's hard to say when a golden age of movies was. It might be, and it might be hard to argue that the 80s was kind of like the prime of movies. It gave us some of the biggest movies and trilogies of all time and really gave rise to the blockbuster. Like, even though Star Wars would get the ball rolling in 1977, it was the momentum and the fandom really took shape in the 80s. And then obviously you have The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and that just allowed it to grow, and people were able to die. Like, I think in Star Wars, when it came out in 1977, it caught people just off guard, and people just didn't know how to process it. But as the years go, that's when the fandom grew and the appreciation grew, and these people now had this whole new thing in their lives that they could go deep into this world with and everything like that. The 80s could also be called the Spielberg era, because you've got the classics like E.T., which was actually the highest money-making movie of the 80s. You had the Goonies. You had the Indiana Jones movies. This is luckily, before Kingdom of the Crystal Skull came out, which that movie can rot in hell. This is the era that brought us the PG-13 rating, which was the perfect movie classification. It allows things to not be so family-friendly, but it doesn't push the envelope too far so that, younger people were isolated from it. And it was actually Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom that would lead to the very first PG, or the creation of the PG-13 rating. But this set the tone for an awesome genre of movies, and we can thank the 80s for that. You also have my all-time favorite, Back to the Future, and then the epic sequel that combined all the best elements of time travel and adventure and everything like that. So with Back to the Future 2, you get a look into the past, the future, and it sort of acts as a prequel, taking us back to the original movie. So I think it's just perfect. There's so many movies we can go on about. That's a whole podcast on its own, just 80s movies. But here are some of the notable movies that round out the decade. So you got Ghostbusters, Beverly Hills Cop, Top Gun, Crocodile Dundee, Three Men and a Baby. You had Gremlins. You had Batman. People always think of it in the 90s, but it makes the cut. Falls in just under the gun there. Okay, second thing that made the 80s a great decade, G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe is one of a handful of iconic toys and cartoons from the 80s. There's a bunch, but it's kind of in that top three, I would say. If you're a kid growing up in this decade, G.I. Joe is one of the biggest parts of your life. Your day would be centered around getting home in time to watch it on TV. Birthdays and Christmas and whatever would be based around asking for and hopefully getting any of the toys or the vehicles or whatever. I still haven't got the aircraft carrier for Christmas. It's been going on 30 years. G.I. Joe, created by Hasbro, it had existed in decades, in the larger figure form. During the Vietnam War, though, any war-based toys took a massive hit in the sales department, and it was really hard to market and sell them. But thanks to the success of the Star Wars toy line, G.I. Joe was now kind of reintroduced in 1982 as a 3.75-inch version as opposed to its old 12-inch size. And there's also a connection with sort of the oil crisis at the time that they couldn't make figures as big, and I think that's what Star Wars was kind of at the front for, was shrinking down action figures, and they were obviously a massive success. G.I. Joe followed suit and entered the action figure as you know it. They also created one of the first marketing approaches by using a cartoon show as basically a 30-minute commercial, well, actually 22 minutes of show and then the rest 8 minutes of commercial time, in order to sell new toys. And making the figures smaller also allowed for Hasbro to make a ton of vehicles they could sell with them that wouldn't be gigantic. I don't think that was the intention, but I think that was a happy accident, because if you look back at the old 60s and 70s G.I. Joe, when it was the giant 12-inch thing, they didn't have a lot of vehicle accessories because they would have just been too big. I think they had some sort of space pod thing, but they're big. But now that these things are smaller, they can introduce planes and tanks and hovercrafts and all sorts of cool stuff. So they would make a lot of these things. They would end up making over 250 different vehicles, and I wanted every single one of them. And the big thing they did with the cartoon, which other toy companies would soon follow, and now is commonplace, but wasn't really much at the time, was they gave G.I. Joe a backstory. Up until then, he had just been an army man. And now he had an enemy in Cobra and a real mission to follow. So when you combine this backstory with traditional marketing and a cartoon and all this together, it's basically like crack for a 10-year-old kid. There was no way to resist the allure of G.I. Joe, and it makes it one of the best toys and cartoons of all time, I would say. Okay, number 3, the music. The 80s brought us so much new variety when it came to music, along with new genres and everything like that. Up until then, I mean, pop music was pretty much rock-based. You had disco and everything like that. You had R&B, you had jazz, everything. But, a lot of what you're listening to was rock music. Heavy metal was becoming more prominent in the 70s. And, pop music's always been in the mix, but the 80s brought us some new categories and variations we hadn't really heard before. It's obvious, again, this is another giant topic. We're just looking at it roughly. But when you think of the 80s, you'll think of probably Michael Jackson, who ruled over it all. You think of Madonna, and you think of U2. It was the era where we introduced a new art form called hip-hop, which I'll cover a bit more in a sec. It gave us new wave music and bands like Devo and New Order and everything like that. We started seeing more house music and more of a growth of punk rock. Death metal became a thing, and Metallica emerged in the 80s. Again, like disco was thankfully long dead, but we are hearing more synthesizer-based music and more electronic production. The 80s still, it still featured the classic bands like the Rolling Stones and Queen, who actually found a whole new generation of fans. And a lot of this all comes together because of MTV, which would launch in 1981 and would forever change the way we consume music. Bands and artists now had to learn this new way to present themselves in this new visual medium, and some bands were left behind that couldn't sort of adapt to this new format and this new platform. But the thing with MTV is it also exposed people to more music that they weren't just hearing on the radio, like the regular top 40. And again, it opened up all this new variety and these new genres. And again, this was the time when album sales meant everything, and it's where the real money was made, unlike today. So let's look at here's the top selling albums by year in the 80s. 1980, see if you can answer before I read them out. 1980, Pink Floyd, The Wall. 1981, top selling album, REO Speedwagon with High Infidelity. 1982 was Asia with their self-titled album Asia. That's awesome. And this is amazing. In 1983 and 1984, the number one album was obviously Thriller by Michael Jackson. That's incredible that it was the top-selling album in 2 consecutive years. 1985, number one album, Bruce Springsteen, Born in the USA. 1986, Whitney Houston. 1987 was Bon Jovi, Slippery When Wet. 1988, sort of surprising, I thought. It was George Michael and Faith, but maybe not if you look back. 1989 was Bobby Brown with Don't Be Cruel. Okay, here is the year-end Billboard number one songs of the 80s. So at the end of the year, number one. 1980 was Call Me by Blondie. 1981, Betty Davis Eyes by Kim Carnes. 1982 was Physical by Olivia Newton-John. 83, Every Breath You Take, The Police. 84, When Doves Cry by Prince. 85 was Careless Whisper by Wham. 86 was That's What Friends Are For, Dion and Friends, which was we sang at my grade 8 graduation. It was brutal. 1987 was Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangles. 88 was Faith by George Michael, and 89 was Look Away by Chicago. So I don't know if there's any surprises to you there. I don't remember Chicago being at the top of the charts. And again, and definitely not Dion and Friends. That was obviously a big hit. I did see Chicago live a year or two ago with Earth, Wind, and Fire. They were unbelievable. Just check them out. So there's a good chance you owned a majority of those albums. And it's most notably a decade where you would sit with your tape deck, listening to the radio, ready to jump on the song you were waiting to record. Except, of course, DJs would talk over most of the intro, so you couldn't like bootleg everything. But that leads us into number 4 of the greatest things of the 80s, the mixtape. If you want to put the 80s in a nutshell, it may be the mixtape. There, obviously no such thing as MP3, Apple Music, Spotify, nothing, obviously. If there wasn't even really CDs until a little bit later, and they weren't more commonplace till later in the decade. If you wanted to capture music, you had to sit diligently by your tape deck just waiting for whatever song you wanted to hear. You would call up radio stations to request it. I did that with 1410 CKSL here where I live. You had to hope you had a good trigger finger. This was also the era of the dual cassette tape deck, which meant you could copy tapes and put together your own mixes. If you knew someone or someone you knew had a tape you wanted, you could copy it over onto a blank one and it was yours. It was amazing. Then there was the great advent of, you remember high-speed dubbing, which would transfer that tape even faster. It was brilliant. Now, with your collection of cassettes, you could make your own compilations, and the mixtape was born from this era. To me, this was the 80s version of a love letter, as you could put together all the meaningful songs to give to the person you liked. I guess now you can do that with, curated Spotify playlists or Apple Music playlists. But that's just a few quick taps. The mixtape took legit work, effort, and commitment, and that's what made a mixtape such a special gift. So now that you have, got this killer mixtape, you've painstakingly put it together, what were you going to listen to it on? And this is number 5 of the top greatest things of the 80s, the Walkman. The Walkman changed the way we consume music. It allowed us to take it on the go, and it was also, kind of a style statement at the same time. We've always had portable music and transistor radios, and they've existed for years, but you were forced to listen to whatever the radio station was playing. With the Walkman, you now had something that was catered just to you. Every tape you put in was your choice, and it revolved around your tastes and your lifestyle. Sony invented the Walkman in 1980. It was almost called the Soundabout. It was created because the owner of Sony at the time wanted to be able to listen to his music while traveling. They had portable tape players, but they were, too big and bulky and not convenient at all. The forefather of the Walkman was called the Pressman, which I was kind of just referring to. It was a mono cassette recorder, but the owner of Sony wanted this, but he wanted it shrunken down, and he wanted it just for playback so he could listen to it on planes when he traveled. So when the Walkman was released, Sony, I have a whole other show just on the Walkman, but this is just a quick recap. When the Walkman was released, Sony was hoping they could sell around 5,000 units a month. In the first 2 months, they sold 50,000. So Again, it became a bit of a statement when, especially when they released the yellow Sport Walkman with the yellow earphones. It was like an accessory, sort of the way, when the first iPod was introduced and the white earbuds, it was sort of a style statement. But now you had your own personal listening device that you could listen to your favorite type of music. And that will move us into the next tip of favorite things of the 80s, and that was hip hop. A whole new art form. So hip hop has its roots in the Bronx, and specifically with DJ Kool Herc, who is credited as the godfather of hip hop. And it's one of those things that came together quite naturally. It's started at house parties, and Herc wanted to always keep people dancing and keep them moving. And they would play funky records, specifically things like James Brown, and albums like that contain moments which they call breaks, which is where there wouldn't be any lyrics and you would just mainly hear the instruments, and usually primarily the drums, the beat, whatever, with the bass line or whatever. And those were considered the breaks. So people love dancing to these break beats. And he found that if he had two of the same record, he could play the break beat back to back for an extended period of time. This would lead to people being able to dance longer, and it also led to break dancers. People were dancing during the break. So whenever there would be a party or an event, the DJ would have a master of ceremonies or an MC, and he would usually make announcements. So about what was coming up, the next parties or the next events or whatever. So they would keep the music going, but they would use the break portion of the record so the MC's announcements wouldn't get mixed up with the other song lyrics. Over time, the MC, was obviously it became more of a promotion thing. And if, they're getting more successful, they had more gigs, they wanted to really make everyone know that the next gig or party was going to be epic. And since they were in the spotlight, they would start to embellish things a little bit. They would start turning into bragging about how good their parties were, how good their DJ was, how good the music was going to be. And then it was more into boasting. Then they would kind of put little rhymes together to, as they're trying to inform, but they wanted to entertain while they had this moment with the mic and the spotlight. The MCs now would start to, with these little rhymes and productions they put together, they now showcase their skills against other MCs, and that led to kind of battling, which they would call it. And then they would start to put full rhymes together so they could kind of go back and forth with one another. People wanted to hear more of this sort of, this new expression. And these MCs would start recording these rhymes that they would perform over these different beats that they found on these records, so they could have their own take on it. Wherever there was a part where there wasn't any lyrics, they would use these beats and they would record their new little rhymes over these kind of pretty funky beats. Basically, that's the birth of hip hop, and it would explode in the 80s. We would get, over the 80s, we would get legends like Grandmaster Flash, Rakim, LL Cool J, Run DMC. We get then into artists like Nas, A Tribe Called Quest. I mean, tons. And, then the things would start to move west. And I recommend listening or watching Hip Hop Evolution on Netflix, and it's hosted by a guy who lived in our own city here named Shad, and it's brilliant. It just looks more into the depth of the early days of hip hop. But like I said, hip hop moved west, and it started including artists like NWA with Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, Eazy-E, Ice-T, Snoop Dogg. We can go on this forever, but hip hop, an amazing thing that came out of the 80s. Okay, the next thing that makes the 80s an amazing decade are the clothes. And it might be, I don't know if there's a decade that gets mocked as much as the 80s for fashion. I don't know, it might take the cake. But when you think of the 80s, it may conjure up, a lot of images of fluorescent pinks and greens, a lot of acid wash, a lot of baggy pants, velvet scrunchies, crimped hair, all kinds of crap like that. Converse high tops were still big, but there was, basically any type of white high top basketball shoe. Again, epic acid wash jeans movement at the time. Everyone had some form of a belt pack or fanny pack or whatever you want to call it. You had leg warmers. You had bike shorts. There's a lot of spandex again, and then you had groups that would popularize different appearances like baggy clothes again, and groups like Run DMC would popularize big gold chains, white Adidas shoes. The underground punk rock movement would embrace acid wash, and then that would make it into the mainstream. And you had punk style that was big, led by like Cyndi Lauper or Madonna, and everyone was wearing blazers with blouses and giant shoulder pads, and it's a lot of crap. And who knows, it probably won't make a comeback, but you can picture what I'm talking about. Okay, the next best thing to come out of the 80s, Transformers. And arguably, again, the best toy and cartoon of the 80s. Again, if not, it's in that top 3. The Transformers toys made by Hasbro were I have a whole other show on Transformers. You can listen to all the history if you look back, one of the first shows I did. And they were a ripoff of the Diaclone toys that were made in Japan. Hasbro basically took them straight up and changed around some of the colors and accessories. But they saw what had happened with the success of G.I. Joe, and they created a 3-part TV series in 1984 that was used to launch the toys. I don't know a single kid my age who was not obsessed with Transformers. You had the iconic characters, Optimus Prime, Megatron, Bumblebee, Starscream, Soundwave, the Dinobots, everything. But like G.I. Joe, you were watching a 30-minute commercial where they were introducing the backstory of the Transformers along with the characters and the vehicles. We were idiot kids. We had no idea, but who cares? It was amazing. I remember being crushed one Christmas. I was certain I was getting a Soundwave, and based on the box I saw wrapped under the tree, so I'm freaking out. It turned out to be one of those big multi-packs of Lifesavers. Do you remember the box? It was like a book. You could open it up and it had like rows of Lifesavers. Crushing. Transformers would lead to a cartoon movie in 86 that would traumatize a lot of kids. The movie killed off a lot of beloved characters. The whole point of this movie was, there's a lot of creativity that goes behind it, but it was done as a way to clear out old inventory and then introduce a bunch of new ones for their upcoming toy line. So again, you're basically watching a 90-minute commercial to set the stage for this new toy line release. And okay, spoiler alert, this is when Optimus Prime dies. There's such a backlash over this that there was massive writing letter campaigns that brought him back into the 2nd season after that. Okay. The next best thing about the 80s, the TV shows. And a bunch of classic sitcoms come our way in the 80s, and it would eventually lead to what they would call must-see TV. Certain nights like Thursday and Friday would become must-watch nights where they would stack a bunch of top shows together. You did not want to miss these nights if you wanted to know what the hell everyone was talking about. But, there's so many shows that are notable from the 80s, like Growing Pains, Who's the Boss, Family Ties, Webster, Full House, Cheers, Alf, The Wonder Years, The A-Team, The Dukes of Hazzard, Knight Rider. There's so many beauties from this time period. So looking at some of the stats here, the #1 show actually from 1985 to 1990, every single year, what do you think it was? The Cosby Show. I forgot what a juggernaut that thing was. And here's a sample of the top 10 rated highest shows. This is right in 1985, right in the middle of the decade. And here are the ratings these shows got. 1 to 10. #1, The Cosby Show. 33.7 million viewers. Family Ties, 30. That's a 30.0. Murder, She Wrote, #3, 25.3. #4 is 60 Minutes with 23.9 rating. #5 is Cheers, 23.7. 6 is Dallas, 21.9. 7 is Dynasty, 21.8. 8 is The Golden Girls, 21.8. 9 is Miami Vice, 21.3. 10 is Who's the Boss at 21.1. The very highest rated sitcoms today will at best do, and that's like a one-off thing, will do at best 15 to 18 million viewers, which wouldn't even put them in the top 30 in the 80s. And most shows these days that are considered successful average around 4 to 6 million viewers. Obviously now there's way more there's different networks, all the streaming services. Very few people actually watch live TV anymore. So TV is kind of dead. TV is kind of like radio, and like streaming services and Netflix and everything. That's like TV now, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like regular TV. I don't think there's a single thing I watch on TV anymore live except for sports. It's either DVR'd or I watch it or stream it online after, or like YouTube it or whatever. But it's just amazing to see that if you were, I mean, there's basically like 3 networks in the 80s. So whatever was on, there's a good chance like a third of the viewing country was watching you. And it's amazing, like looking at The Cosby Show and Family Ties getting over 30 million viewers. And that's just an average week. That's not including like big specials or season finales or season premieres or everything like that. That's just the average in the 80s. Yeah, pretty amazing. Okay, next thing that makes the 80s an amazing decade, the breakfast cereals. Amazing time to be alive if you're a kid in the 80s, because breakfasts were an event. There were so many over-the-top sugar-laden cereals with intensive marketing that you could not resist. They were colorful, they were novel, they had no nutrition, they probably had some form of free toy inside. It was everything you wanted. It was a big era for interactive cereal boxes, and you probably spent your whole breakfast totally engaged in the cereal box. To a kid, this is basically like your daily newspaper was going over this thing. Cereal commercials were basically low-level cartoon shows that were trying to trick you into wanting whatever product, but it was something that could help you identify it. It's why cereals would use cartoon animals. They call it, anthropomorphism, and kids actually connect more with animals and they have more trust and more want. So that's why you see all those things like Tony the Tiger and Toucan Sam and everything like that. Very shady marketing technique. But again, nutrition is out the window because the idea of being able to eat cookies for breakfast is mind-blowing. So here is a few notable 80s cereals. And again, I've done a whole show on this one too. Cookie Crisp, Pac-Man cereal, C-3POs, one of my favorites, ice cream cone cereal, Smurf Berry Crunch, Pro Stars, that was more of a Canadian thing, E.T. cereal, that might be my all-time favorite too, Marshmallow Krispies, Mr. T cereal, the highest sugar-containing cereal ever is Mr. T cereal, S'mores Crunch, I mean, there's a ton. Okay, a few more things, let's go. Next best thing of the 80s, Saved by the Bell. So Saved by the Bell would carry over into the 90s, but it's still 80s at its core. The story of Zach, Lisa, Kelly, Jesse, Slater, and Screech would show us this magical world of Bayside High in California. Saved by the Bell started as a show called Good Morning Miss Bliss. They knew the focus of the Miss Bliss character wasn't going to steer the direction of the show, but instead it was this character named Zach Morris looking like it would. Played by, I can never say his name, Mark Paul Gosselaar, which I don't even think is right. Zach Morris was a student at John F. Kennedy Junior High in Indianapolis, Indiana. Started in '88 and would only last one season before being retooled as Saved by the Bell. The character of Zach, Screech, Lisa, and Principal Belding were brought over from Good Morning Miss Bliss to Saved by the Bell. The transition had them kind of moving to this fictional town called Bayside. You can almost think of this as Saved by the Bell, the junior high years with Good Morning Miss Bliss, but the character of Zach Morris would actually change a lot. He was kind of like more of a loser in this original one, but now in Saved by the Bell, he would basically get away with everything. He played every sport. He was a musician. He got an impossible 1502 on his SAT scores. The goal was to create one of the only live-action Saturday morning TV shows. Saturday mornings obviously are prime time for cartoons, and doing a live-action show was going to give them a chance to stand out. It also catered to older kids who were starting to get past the cartoon phase, but still, love the Saturday morning TV experience. The first show they did would be called Dancing to the Max, and the Saved by the Bell era began on August 20th, 1989, 2 days after my birthday. Fun fact, the original producers hated the name Saved by the Bell and disallowed it to be used in any of the theme songs. 4 different theme songs were made, and only one contained the words Saved by the Bell. The producers had to cave to the one we know because it sounded the best by far. But it's funny, they just despise that name. Okay, let's go a few more. The next greatest thing about the 80s, the video games. In case you're not aware, the 80s, especially the early 80s, was a time where video games almost died, believe it or not. Basically, no one really wanted to be involved in the production of video games ever again. Like Atari, I've covered this whole show with the ET Atari video game, And Atari ruled the roost going into the early 80s, but it led to what is called the Great Video Game Crash of '83. And some people chalk it up to that E.T. Atari video game, which is considered one of the worst of all time, but it's more like it was just the final nail. It had been waiting to happen for a while. Atari had no control over the video games they had that were being released. Anyone could make video games for Atari, and so there was so much crap that flooded the market, and this just turned kids away from buying video games. There was no trust in it. They were getting more interested in home computers now that were hitting the market, like the Commodore 64, which could play all those games and do a lot more on top of it. So within a few short years, the video game industry went from around $2 billion a year down to only $100 million. The cause of this whole issue caused the crash of what was seen as an absolute juggernaut that would never fail. They just thought they would cruise through decades and decades, but the crash caused companies to distance themselves from anything to do with video games. Companies like Hasbro, Mattel were so burned they lost hundreds of millions of dollars with investments in what they thought was a never-ending industry, but it died. And those companies started making more traditional toys. They started making, that's where you see things like the Pound Puppies and Micro Machines and toy cars, going back to more traditional things because they thought video games were done, until an upstart company from Japan called Nintendo came on the scene. Nintendo had started as a trading card company in Japan in 1889, and eventually over the years moved into electronics and then into video games. They released the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1986, actually 85, but fully in 86, and it would become the best-selling console of its time and change the industry forever. We would also get the Sega Genesis, and tons of amazing games. Here are the top 10 selling video games of the 80s. Number one, probably guess, Super Mario Brothers from 1985 sold 40.24 million units. Number two, Tetris from 1984 sold 30.26 million copies. Number three, Duck Hunt, 1984 sold 28.31 million copies. This is interesting because most Nintendo packages you bought, like the action set and all that stuff, came with either Mario Brothers or Duck Hunt. And fun fact, Mario wasn't seen as being the flagship of Nintendo. When they first released the NES, Mario was not included in the original box set. Everything was based around do you remember the Nintendo Rob, the robotic operating buddy, and the games like Gyromite? Duck Hunt was in the mix too, but Mario was never factored in, but that's what actually would propel Nintendo, but very interesting. Number four, Super Mario Land from 1989, 18.14 million copies. Number five, Super Mario Brothers 3 from 88, 17.28 million copies. Number six, Super Mario Brothers 2 from 88, 7.46 million copies. Number seven, Pac-Man from 82 for Atari, 7 million copies. Number 8, The Legend of Zelda from 86, 6.51 million copies. Number 9, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link from 87, which sold 4.38 million copies. And number 10 was a tie between Excitebike and Pitfall from 84 and 82 respectively, both selling 4.16 million copies. Pretty interesting. Okay. The last thing, and this might sound weird, but the last thing that made the 80s great, and this is a massive topic, which I'll try and sum down, is deregulation. So what the hell is deregulation, you might ask? Well, it's responsible for the huge amount of pop culture we experienced in the 80s. Up until this point, the act of advertising to children was heavily regulated. Through a lot of research and study, it was concluded that young children could not differentiate between a TV show and an advertisement. It also showed the damage that happened from targeting youngsters and exposing them to so much promotion. This severely limited the amount of toys and products that could be directed to and targeted towards children. And this is where Ronald Reagan comes into play. One of the first things Reagan does after becoming president is appointing a new head of the FCC in 1981. His name was Mark Fowler. The first thing he did was lift the ban on advertising to kids and said that children's television should be dictated by the marketplace. This is why you see an explosion of cartoons and cartoon-related toys in the 80s, along with all the cereals and the junk food and all those McDonald's commercials that look like cartoons and everything. There is nothing holding manufacturers back from pushing anything they wanted. And that's why we got G.I. Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony, He-Man, Strawberry Shortcake, Voltron, She-Ra. I mean, everything was based because of this deregulation. A lot of work had been done to stop toy-inspired programs. And it's like they have like 40 to 60,000 pages of research. And there was lobbies and committees and commissions that were all about like protecting kids from all this advertising and this onslaught and how it would affect them and how it manipulated them, and work with psychologists and child researchers and educators. There's so much that goes behind all this. They just lift it all up. They're like, nope, go nuts. The market will dictate everything. And that's why you see shows like Transformers and G.I. Joe basically being half-hour commercials. Gem and the Holograms, all the same thing. Again, it's the huge amount of junk food and cereal releases in the 80s. They make them look like cartoons, and it was also the fast food companies, specifically McDonald's. They can make everything look more child friendly. It's why all the Grimace and Birdie and all these things are introduced. It's just a way because they know that I talked about that anthropomorphism and kids identifying with animals, especially cartoon animals, and it's why all these things look the same. The kids have no idea what's what at this point, especially the younger ones. When you get over like 12, 13, they can start obviously differentiating stuff, and even not that well. But with the younger kids, no clue. It's also like the Happy Meal would come out in the 80s using that same approach. So it's kind of a double-edged sword because the intentions were always commercial. Commerce is the name of the game, but it gave us some of the most beloved shows we know today. So I don't know how upset we can really be. And, despite the commercial aspects, a lot of these shows really had creativity behind them, and they were made from creative people and by creative people. They would focus on the story, just because that's who they were as creators. But, it also would create more of an attachment to everything. Okay, so we'll wrap it up here. It's funny to think how we have Ronald Reagan to thank for, our most beloved toys and cartoons. They said that kids would dictate the market. If something was good and popular, the kids would let you know. If not, it would fade away. And I guess we did. It was, if something was crap enough, you just wouldn't be interested in anymore, and it would fall by the wayside. So much of the 80s was able to tap into our sense of wonder, and we liked what we liked. A lot of these things still hold up, especially the movies. Some things go down in flames, like the fashion. And you look back, I say you look back at it a little more fondly. Some of the cartoons look a lot crappier than you may remember. The music might even seem better than you remember. And it felt like a time where there was a bit of focus on the art and the medium, and we weren't oversaturated with so much content from every direction, without social media and streaming services and multiple channels and YouTube that's coming at every which direction. There was, you had a little more focus on certain things, and you could appreciate them a little more. As time goes by, these things might seem even more and more endearing over the years, and we'll look back at it even more fondly, in another 10 or 20 years. So I realize this barely skims the surface, but hopefully you like this look back at what made the 80s the greatest decade. So thanks for listening. If you like the show, make sure you subscribe. Leave it a rating and review if you really like it. That way more people get to see it. But that's it for me. See you later. Bye.